What's up, friends? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is Brian and myself, and we are going to be discussing the three mechanisms of hypertrophy. So hypertrophy, aka muscle building, is something we obviously talk about a lot, but there are a couple different facets or mechanisms for which you can facilitate it. And oftentimes we get maybe pigeonholed into one methodology. I know I personally have myself historically, and we just wanted to have an episode talking about the different mechanisms, what you can learn, take away from each, and then how you can kind of structure these into your training to completely round out all of the gains that you are trying to make. Before we jump into this, Brian, what's going on with you?
Yeah, we've made it to week 2 in San Diego, and everything is gliding along smoothly. Our nanny has shown up every day. We've had time to work out. We've had time to have personal time and kind of walk along the beach. We've had time to do our work. And so that's been amazing. I mean, I couldn't have imagined being here without that type of reliability and confidence. So it's been great. It's honestly been super enjoyable. The weather shifted. So the first 3 or 4 days we were here, we were like 55 and rainy for most of the days, or cloudy at least. And then the last 3 or 4 days have been more like mid 60s, low 70s and sunny, which is really, really nice and like short sleeve weather, to be outside, but it's still not warm enough to go in the water. And I think Bryson's a little disappointed about that. He loves, wading into the water and then running out. And when he gets wet, it basically is like a day ruiner because then he's cold as soon as he gets out of the water and everything falls apart from there. So unfortunately, we do have to come back at some time in the summer, and maybe not unfortunately, fortunately, we will have to come back at some point in the summer and let him experience like true San Diego beach. But that's all been good. Training's going great. I'm still mentally torn in how I feel about training in a commercial gym where I don't have exactly what I want when I want type thing. But it's less significant of a problem in my brain now than it was 5 or 7 days ago. So I'm slowly adapting and accepting, and I've kind of found my space in the gym. Like, okay, maybe I can't go dual cable lateral raise to T-bar row because they're in different rooms, but I can go dual cable lateral raise to cable row. So, it's making that sub of like, okay, a T-bar row is meant to be for the rear delts and upper back. My elbows are traveling out a little bit. I can emulate that same movement pattern with a cable row, and that's right next to my dual cable raise. So I can kind of rope off this little circuit for myself and do it that way. And I've found similarly in other parts of my training too, that there's just certain pieces that I can do together exactly as I had them planned, and then other ones where I can emulate movement patterns and stimulus, but the precise exercise selection isn't exactly as necessarily I would have had it at home. So these are things that, like I said, as time goes on, I will become more comfortable with. Had the opportunity yesterday to have Lori, Christine King, and our other business associate, Laura Savino, down to train with me yesterday. So that was cool. I took them to the gym, and they got to experience like the rooftop, like nothing like SoCal, lifting outside in the sun type thing. So
very cool.
Yeah, it was rad. And I was in fact able to superset my seated leg curl to my 1.5 hip extensions. And that was the one superset in my whole program that I was like, man, if I can't do this, like it really changes the stimulus that I'm going after. Because you can't emulate a hip extension with another hip hinge because it's short overloaded versus an RDL, which is lengthened overloaded. And then on top of that, I wouldn't want to do RDLs 2 days in my training. I think that's too much at my level. So I'm really happy that I was able to fit that superset in, and everything else has just kind of been figuring it out as I go. But I know you guys are heading out of town tomorrow. And so, yeah, what's going on with that? What's up with your updates?
Really just tomorrow morning, 5 a.m., 4 a.m., we're hitting the road and got an 18-hour drive to Oklahoma City where we will spend the night. So I don't know. I like the road trips, I guess. The change is fun. And I just know that this is probably the only time that I'll be like driving West Coast to East Coast back, and then I just kind of with where like where I'm at in my life and my plans with Jenny and stuff like that, like we are nearing the end of our like travel life. We might have a year and a half left or something like that. So I just know like, oh, like this is probably the last time I'm going to do this type of thing. So things have like different intrinsic value in that sort of manner. But I'm excited. I feel bad saying this because I think it's been largely mitigated by unfortunate Airbnb situations, but like I'm fucking ready to leave Arizona. And like I said, I feel like that's unfair to, I've met like a ton of my clients here. I've got to hang out with Jeremiah Bear, which has been fantastic. We went to like really cool conferences and I finally got to meet people in person. So there's been like a lot of positive, but we've just had 2 back-to-back like crappy living situations, and it's really kind of soured the last few months for me. So I'm ready to leave, right? I'm ready to move on, which I'm excited for. And then kind of what is going to facilitate this conversation was I got a DEXA scan on Friday. And things were interesting, let's put it that way. On the surface, I have more body fat, which I knew because I've been, purposely feeding up, but also on the surface, less muscle mass than I did in November. So generally, one of those you want to be either higher or lower, but when they both go in the opposite direction, you would hope it's kind of defeating, let's say that. Yeah. But what was really cool is we got a cool message from someone on Instagram, which we will kind of talk about, that will lead us into really the thought and discussion behind this entire podcast. But before we jump into that, I know there was a couple of things we wanted to talk about, so let's do those.
Yeah, we just had 2 kind of quick asides that one was on my brain and one you just read in my story. So we'll talk about what's on my brain real quick. Someone on one of my Q&A boxes last week asked me just a simple question of, do you do your first set to 1 to 2 RIR for 8 to 12 reps and your second set to 0 to 1 RIR for 8 to 12 reps? And I was like, scratching my head being like, man, that's like really a simplified way of looking at things. And that's not really actually the way I do things. So what it did is it forced me to kind of think about, hey, how do I actually do things? And then in doing so and thinking about how I do things, it made me realize that the way I do things is very dependent upon what movement it is, whether it's a lengthened mid-range overload movement or whether it's a shortened overload movement. And that the manner in which I institute my work sets, proximity to failure, rep ranges, things like that, as well as how I might progress those movements week to week, also changes. So I thought that just the fact that I realized this and was able to put it into like a cute little box on my story Q&A, I thought would be provide some valuable context potentially for you guys too, as you think about movements and how you might institute or progress them. And I think it also kind of relates to our conversation today about mechanical tension and the different mechanisms of hypertrophy. So when we have our lengthened overload movements, which every episode I have to say this just in case people didn't listen to the prior one, lengthened overload movements are the ones that are hardest in the stretched position. So you can think of your RDLs, your back squats, bench presses, things like that, where you won't actually fail the movement at the top because the top is actually more of like a resting place. The top of the RDL, the top of the squat, the top of the bench press, you don't have tension on the muscle. You're essentially resting. Alternatively, short overload movements are hardest at the top. So you can think about movements like a leg extension, a cable crossover, a cable bicep curl, a pull down, a row, something like that, right? So when we have these short overload movements, we know for sure that A, these cause a lot less muscle damage, one of the mechanisms of hypertrophy. And they also are less stimulative per dose, right? So like one set of a cable spider curl would be less of a dose than one set of like an incline dumbbell curl or a face away cable curl or something like that takes the bicep through a stretched position. So even looking at these on like a grand scale, let's just break them down into like, we have these big like so-called compound movements. We'll call them the RDL and the squat. These ones I don't ever take past failure because there's so much to gain being further from failure. So the way that I might start a block of training with these big compound lengthened overload movements is something like 4 reps from failure. Because even if you're doing 2 or 3 sets at 4 reps from failure, you're getting a pretty good stimulus. Then each week from there, it might go down to like 3 reps from failure, then 2 reps from failure, then 1 rep from failure. And then I might have a couple weeks in a row where I'm hitting 0 to 1 reps from failure. But there's really I don't really do like reverse drop sets or any sort of, rest pause sets. Like I couldn't even imagine doing a rest pause set on like a pendulum or something like that, where you're like, all right, I'm going to get out of the machine for 15 seconds, and then I'm going to get back in. And like, what are you going to get? Like 1 more rep, 2 more reps or something like that.
I did have that in my last block. And then one of my friends came and trained with me. Ryan, he's a power lifter. And he was able to load that pendulum with a lot. He was able to load it more than anyone else I'd ever seen it. And we did a cluster set on it. And he said it ruined him for like 4 or 5 days.
Right. So we don't do that. We don't do like past failure techniques on these big compound movements. However, when you look at the smaller, like short overloaded movements, and I say smaller, but man, a lat pull down and a barbell row, these are both like what would be considered compound movements. They work multiple joints, but I would still say because of the fact that they overload short, you just don't think of them in the same way or to be quite as damaging, especially a pull down. Like I feel like the barbell row has that stretch at the bottom. So even though your lats specifically aren't under load at the bottom of a barbell row, that's maybe a bad example because you are being kind of pulled apart by this weight. So maybe like a cable row or a lat pull down are better examples here. But essentially on those movements, I have no problem even starting a block of training at close to failure. Like usually I'll start 1 to 2 RIR, 1 RIR, something like that. And then the progression from there is, I'm going to add weight and or reps until I can't. So that might be, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. But as soon as I can no longer feasibly add reps or weight week to week, then I'm looking to progress the stimulus with those movements in some way where, it's going to be like some partial reps added or maybe more partial reps or a reverse drop set or a rest pause set or something like that. Because I can we as a people can do these types of movements and incur significantly less damage and fatigue than we would from those like more squatty, lengthened RDLE type movements. So when I actually responded to this person and put this on my story, I was able to break it down into this pretty little box where I'm like, okay, lengthened overload, like big compound movements, they go something like 3 to 4 RIR in week 1, and then they just progress week to week, regardless of what happens with the RIR and stuff. I just basically will add load or reps, and every week I'm going to add something until I can't, and then I'll hit failure for a few weeks, and that's the way it goes. Obviously, in an RDL, you have to be a little more careful than you do with a pendulum, I think, just by the nature of the fact that, you're unbraced in an RDL, as I think you would, take the same precautions with a back squat versus a pendulum, but somewhere in that range of starting 3 to 4 RIR and then progressing week to week. And then when I talked about the short overload movements, it literally went start at about 1 RIR and then progressively add weight reps and / intensity techniques week to week to increase the stimulus. And then eventually you end up at this point where you can go refer to our last episode on deloads and discuss kind of how we handle things in those situations and progress forward from there. So I just thought that was interesting, and as you go through your own training and think about things, like all movements don't have to start at 3 to 4 RIR and then progress and end at failure. There are ways in which you can get more out of certain movements without having to overly fatigue yourself in doing so. And then there are certainly movements that you should probably be more cautious and careful with. So for what that's worth, hopefully you guys gain something from that.
I think so. It's great for this particular episode because we're breaking down different parts of like lifting weights for hypertrophy. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. It's interesting because generally like lifting weights from a macro is like this very physical effort based, thing. But then in order to get like really, really good at it, you need to bring in the like intellectual side of things and understanding different parts of the sciences. And then like wondering, oh man, this one day crushes me. But like, why does it crush me? And it's like, well, maybe you're just doing a ton of lengthened overload stuff. And then there's, intensity techniques on top of it. And it's like, there's just so much muscle damage by changing things a little bit, maybe replacing one of those with like not a lengthened overload. Like you can be much more, you could increase your training frequency without really reducing your volume and different things like that. Like these different variables come into play that change how things end up, your outcomes with them.
Yeah, for sure. I actually think this is a good explanation of that. I had a quad day that I did last Saturday, and I was sore literally for 5 days, like to the point that I had to go out of order with my program, and I moved a chest and back workout ahead of my next quad workout because they were still sore. And I have these 2 different quad days, and they're very different because one day is 2 sets of leg extensions, 2 sets of pendulum, and 2 sets of sissy squats. And that day destroys me. That's the one that ruined me for 5 days, because when you look at those movements, the leg extension isn't necessarily lengthened overloaded, but the pendulum and the sissy are. And then on my other quad day, which is hack squat and leg extensions with a pause at the top, it's generally 2 to 3 sets of each, so it's similar volume overall, but with the leg extension being pause at the top instead of kind of gradual ascent but no pause at the top, the amount of load I could use with the pause at the top was like 20% less than the other one. Exactly. And the fact that I did the leg extension second after the hack squat versus doing leg extension first probably incurred a ton of fatigue going into the pendulum. So you can look at these rationalizations or these kind of things that you just mentioned, and you can kind of see why one leg day is a beat down and the other one doesn't really produce a ton of soreness for me, but both can be stimulative.
Yep, I have the exact same thing with my current one. I know I've talked to you about this, and I did the 3rd one on Saturday of this iteration, and my quads I wake up demolished, and it's only 5 sets. I do 2 sets on the pendulum, I do 1 set on the Cybex squat press, and then I do 2 sets of rear foot elevated, front foot wedge split squats. I think it's a split squats, to be completely honest. So moving forward, I'm only going to do 1 set on those, and I'll literally only have 4 working sets on that quad day. And I'm so incredibly sore. It is outrageous. It's really, really silly to me, but it's one of those things, like when you know what you're looking to, when you know the stimulus you're looking to target, and you have spent time listening to podcasts like this, going through educations and things like that, like you're able to be so much more precise, and it's really, really wild. To me, at least.
Well, those are certainly all lengthened overload movements that you're doing as well. So maybe if you get less sore from doing 1 set of split squats, you can then maybe add in an additional set of Cybex squat press, and now you have 5 sets, but you have 5 sets again, but 1 less of the most damaging one being the split squat. And then this also feeds super well into the other kind of aside that we wanted to take before the main discussion, where I reposted a post from Jordan Lips, and it basically said, would my form, range of motion, tempo, and control improve if I lowered the weight? And what you kind of stated was it's difficult to find a balance between all these considerations while still working hard enough to facilitate an adaptation. And I actually think that like what you just said about that leg day that you have, and like the way that you're doing the front foot, rear foot wedged elevated split squat thing, like if anything, like you're an example of this quote working in my mind, because I in the past have been of that mindset of, the amount of weight you're using is really important as long as your movement looks the same. But I see you train a lot, like even some of the stuff, like when you do rear delt rows, and I saw you doing these at N1, you were using like 40-pound dumbbells or 50s or something, and you said they were really hard. I was using like 85s. So like, why do I need double the amount of weight as you? And same thing on the split squat, right? Like I was doing the split squats at the N1 practical with hundreds in each hand. And I bet you were using like 40s or 50s, but you're looking to get more out of that, right? Is that right? 40s or 50s?
30s.
And that's what so either way, a third.
Yeah.
A third of what I used, right? So you're literally an example of this quote in effect. Like you are using less weight, but you're making some sort of internal connection with the muscle. You're using maybe more range of motion than you would prior. Maybe you're recruiting less auxiliary, like assistance musculature, than you would if you were using heavier weights. Maybe you're getting less sore in your glutes than you would if you're using heavier weights because it's a bigger muscle. It helps you kind of compensate and use more weight in your split squat. So I think that that's all really relevant and important context there. What do you think?
It is. And what's really, really cool is you added a new wrinkle to it, which I wasn't really thinking about when I read it. And there's like, when you are using like more, the word that comes to mind is technical movements. You want to make sure that you are performing them for the intended musculature. Something like a split squat, you can always kind of shift your knee drive back a little bit, make it more, glute dominant, right? Where you're going to have better levers. You can move a lot more weight, but then I know like historically that next day my ass is on fire and sore and not my quads. So I think it's really like the sweet spot is understanding why you want to use certain things. And then kind of like the bigger discussion, what I originally thought is there's kind of like this pendulum between like, okay, you're young, you're in college, you're, in high school, you're ego lifting because like that's the only thing right? Pretty much. And we've all been there. Then the other side of it is like you're so focused on like your form, your tempo, control, all of these things that you're not actually loading the muscle or working hard enough to facilitate an adaptation. Like at the end of the day, in order for that muscle to grow, there needs to be a sufficient stimulus for an adaptation to occur. So like I can do perfect form, these incredibly beautiful, dumbbell curls with a 12-pound dumbbell. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be enough stimulus for my body to send that signal like, hey, these 12-pound dumbbells are like damaging. We need to facilitate an adaptation. And at the end of the day, like it's important to understand that part as well. And this is something that the post from Jordan just kind of like kicked off like things I've seen in my mind that are becoming really prevalent now of like Instagram posts where people are like, don't do workouts like this, do them like this. And it's like them going super slow, doing like this perfect row with no load. And then it's helpful from like seeing the perfect way to do it, but I feel like it can, again, swing that pendulum. Then you see people who are like doing these things, but there's not enough load to facilitate an adaptation. So like you can have the most perfect form in the world, but you still need a sufficient amount of load to target to facilitate an adaptation to occur. So it's finding that balance of like my form is good, I'm not, and this is why it's great to video yourself and stuff. My form is good, my tempo matches my intended tempo, I feel control, but now I'm trying really hard in actually putting or driving a stimulus through the intended musculature.
Yeah, it's very gray.
It is.
Because like ultimately, if you're trying as hard as you can to do a row and you fail to get the dumbbell into whatever the range of motion is that you established as your desired range of motion, then in theory, you're working hard enough to create that adaptation. So this is where I think it's confusing because something like a row or a lateral raise are both very, very impacted by even the subtlest use of momentum. So, man, like if you're doing it, I can do like a super strict dumbbell row and make it look pristine, with 100 or 110, something like that. And I could row 140 pounds, but maybe there would be some momentum in there, a little bit of body English. Maybe every rep doesn't look exactly like the prior rep, right? So now we're having like the two sides of the spectrum. Well, I guess the one side of the spectrum is the 140. And then the other side of the spectrum would be like if I wasn't using 100 pounds and I was using like 60. And so my form was just as good as it was at 100, but I was like arbitrarily just using less weight for no reason. And then as a result of using less weight for no reason, I never actually reached a point where, I was approaching failure type thing. So it's finding that balance between like the weight not being too light that it's not getting you there, or the weight being too heavy that you're getting there, but you're having to compensate with other musculature. So there's like that sweet spot of load in the middle where these different facets are optimized and you can take the muscle close to failure, but you don't feel like you're losing any of the control, tempo, range of motion, and these other different avenues.
Yeah, the row is a really good example, especially like a barbell row, right? Because where you can load it up heavy enough where now it's taxing on your posterior chain, right? And then you have to account for that into one, you're getting less, I don't say, maybe you are, maybe you aren't getting less tension through the lats, which you actually want to train, but you're increasing a lot on like your glutes, hamstrings, and that might impact your glute hamstring day if depending on how your things are structured. So it is gray. It definitely is. But what I was getting at is just I wanted to put that out there that it is gray, and just as long as you're understanding that you want to be somewhere in the middle, not on either end, is kind of what I wanted to get at.
What about, just real quick, the idea, because this is the first thing that popped into my head when you put this in the document, is like you and I have both experienced with like RDLs and stiff-legged deadlifts where, we could add 50, 80 pounds to the bar and it would actually look from the outside, it would look the same. It would look as if there's no sacrifice in range of motion or control or any of that stuff. And yet you can feel it in your body internally. Like, that when you drop 50 or 80 pounds off that thing, that even though it looks the same as it did heavier, that you're getting more out of that at the lower load. So like, that's just kind of where my head went when I first read that.
Yeah, it's hard because to me, and this is purely conjecture here, theoretical, I feel like that would be the appropriate approach. That being said, I can't 100% say certainly of like how that translates to hypertrophy at the end of it. I just can't confidently say in either way.
Right.
But it feels better. It feels safer. It feels more targeted. I just don't know if that feeling has, how much weight that actually carries in a science perspective.
I mean, it's just weird because like even like for the same amount of reps, right? Like you did 275 on your stiff-legged deadlifts that we talked about last week, and you were shaky coming up on the last rep. Like you had that hitchy thing, like your hamstrings were kind of like firing awkwardly, and you like barely made this rep at 275 for 10 or whatever it was. But I bet if you put 315 or 335 on the bar, you could also do 10 reps. And so it's like, are you faking that you're actually slowing down and that you're not actually able to make that rep? Like, is it just like your body, like in your mind, you're like, well, this should be hard now. So yeah, like it's just, I'm going to slow this down. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just this weird, ambiguous.
I know what you mean. And I think there might be like, what's the word? Compromises that are kind of invisible to an external eye where the movement looks the same, but from the person doing the movement, those compromises are perceivable. So like I could bend my knees ever so slightly. I could add more rounding in my back, which might not be perceptible to someone standing over there really, or a video, but I know that I'm using more back and glute and less hamstring because that's how I did RDLs for a very long time. Like I remember back in the CFPB days, we would do sets of 6 and 8s of RDLs with like 350 on the bar. But it was very different than I do them now. But from someone watching from a video, it may not seem that different, but from like a person performing it, like I know the difference. I know that feeling back then would be a lot more like spinal erectors, and that's probably why our spinal erectors were fucking monstrous, as opposed to like how I did them last week, which was much more limited by hamstrings.
Yep. No, fully. I agree with that. You want to jump into this DEXA business?
Yeah, let's actually talk about the episode now. So I said I got a DEXA right last week, and on the surface, right, I was up body fat and I was down lean body mass, but I was down, it said 4.4 pounds. So sufficient enough to me where I was like, oh wow, something has changed. And just to kind of reiterate, I did make a full Instagram post on it where I put a lot of details. But whenever I get DEXAs, I try and reduce as many variables as I personally can control. I take them all fasted. I always try and schedule them about 9 to 10 in the morning, which is generally like when the first ones are available. And I'll just have water and stuff in the morning. So I try and reduce variables. So there was someone that was at the N1 practical with me, Val. She's a lifter, competitor, IFBB pro, super, super cool. And she added her thought why potentially it may seem like my muscle mass went down. And she said, you haven't lost muscle, but you can tell that they're not as full when comparing the two photos. You've lost fullness due to muscle glycogen. You were doing more metabolic work when I got the first DEXA and on the first picture, which increases the sarcoplasmic fluid in the muscle fibers. And this time I'm doing more strength work which creates a different kind of stimulus. So this was really, really cool because it is true. Like my volume is lower now, but I'm doing heavier loads and taking things much closer to failure. Like I said, I only had 5 reps on my leg day, but they were all very, very hard sets.
5 sets.
Oh yes, sorry, 5 sets, yeah, not 5 reps. But back in like the fall of the previous year, I would do like 4 sets of one exercise, you know what I mean? And then I would do like 3 or 4. So that really was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I wanted to talk about it. And this is a great idea for a podcast. So what we're going to do is kind of cover the 3 mechanisms for hypertrophy. And then also I figured what would be really good, Brian, to start with is just kind of the 2 types of hypertrophy, which really was related to Valerie's comment on my post.
Yeah, totally. So what Val was essentially saying is that by you losing fluid essentially within your muscles, she's talking about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So this is essentially the accumulation of fluid or muscle glycogen. It's kind of what happens to your muscles when you get a pump in the gym, except that in certain circumstances and styles of training, your body kind of retains this pieces of the pump, not the full pump, because that would be kind of wild if you just walked around like full chest pump all day long.
The everlasting
but yeah, I don't even know if it would be like, it would kind of decrease some of the excitement of getting one if you just had one all the time, you know? But either way, so your body can actually retain some of that pump in the form of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And this is actually a relatively new finding in the scientific literature. I mean, maybe even in the last like 2-3 years is kind of when a lot of this stuff came out, and Cody Hahn and Brandon Roberts, and I've heard other people talking about this as well. But when you train in a manner conducive to sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is often higher volumes and a style that is more based in metabolic stress, which we'll get into in a second, then you do kind of have more muscle. But it's like this weird ambiguous muscle where like if you took like a week off of training, you don't lose real muscle, you lose sarcoplasmic muscle, which is just fluids. But it's like still considered muscle. It's like when muscle. You go get a DEXA, it's inside the muscle, so it's muscle. It's just not myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is the other type of hypertrophy, and that is the actual growth in size and strength of your individual muscle fiber sarcomeres. So that is the type of hypertrophy that you get. Like if somebody were powerlifting style training where you're just doing sets of like 1 to 5 and you never get a pump, you would essentially have like almost 0 sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and you would have a ton of myofibrillar hypertrophy. I actually just mentioned sarcomeres, which I actually, now that I say it, it seems like it would fit into sarcoplasmic, but I thought it was part of myofibrillar. So I'll have to look into that, because the sarcomeres are actual like the streams of the muscle fibers, I believe. But either way, so essentially those are the 2 types, myofibrillar and sarcoplasmic. And Val was mostly saying that you lost sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, but you may have not actually lost the strength and the size of your actual muscle fibers, right? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was racking my brain, right? Because I was like, you know, I know there's different influences of what goes into, you know, muscle size. And it's like technically, but I don't want to say technically because it's inside the muscle, like we just talked about. And people were like, well, what about, you know, glycogen? Maybe you were eating more carbs. And I was like, I was eating double the amount of carbs after than I was before. So if anything, I would kind of, you know, sandbag this most recent DEXA. But that was the same. It was like I was having like monster pumps and stuff back then, but now I mean, I still am getting them on mostly lower body days as opposed to upper body, but it's from the training stimulus is really different. And it was like a light bulb went off. And granted, she is kind of reinforcing like wishful thinking on my end. Like, oh, no, Aaron, you didn't lose any muscle. Like it was just a temporary representation, or a temporary like maximal representation of the muscle you do have, right? So it's kind of confirming my bias here, which obviously just makes me feel better about myself. But it is rooted in a very realistic scenario, which I thought was just really interesting that she picked up on that.
I wonder if 4.4 pounds or whatever of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, if the delta between your old sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and your current state of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy could be 4.4 pounds. Like, I don't know enough about it. Like, if anyone on here listening potentially knows how much glycogen can you hold in your muscles.
Oh, yeah, I know that. Man, I want to say it's either, I think it's 300 grams to 400 grams of muscle glycogen, right? And obviously, if you're a smaller person, you're a larger person, that's muscle glycogen. But for every gram of glycogen, your body's going to pull approximately 3 grams of water. It's a 2.7, I believe, precisely. But then you basically multiply that by 3, right? So let's say it's 400 grams of glycogen. You multiply that by 3. Now you're getting 1,200 total grams. A pound is like 450 grams. Let's call it 400 for simple. So we're talking like 3 to 4 pounds, basically, of muscle glycogen and fluid you can manipulate just from the glycogen and directly accompanying water with that glycogen.
Right, but is that actually going into like, is that considered sarcoplasmic hypertrophy versus just being like is that in my mind, I'm thinking of that as the layer of fluid that's outside of the muscle, between the muscle and the fat. But I think sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is the fluid inside the muscle, which would be different than what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's not something I feel confident speaking with conviction on. I know like what I was just speaking about are like your acute shifts of like a loading before a competition or something like that.
Right, but that's more dependent on carb intake versus style of training type thing, right?
Yep.
So I'm trying to go more on the side of like style of training. So you were training with higher volumes, you were getting more pumps, these types of things. So there's more intracellular fluid in the muscle belly, the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, versus potentially the way you're training now where you're not really getting pumps, you're working closer to failure, you're doing lower volumes, things like that. So like what, I just don't know the difference. Like, I think you know where I'm trying to go with that, but it's like,
I don't know either.
I don't know what the delta is between like right now, even you wouldn't say that you have 0 sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. You would say you have some level of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy that's less than what you had before potentially.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all interesting. I'm not super well read on that research, so I'm not going to try and go talk myself into a hole here, but but I find that interesting and thought-provoking.
It's super interesting.
So then,
thought-provoking, yeah.
Yeah. So then we can kind of jump into the 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy. And it's interesting because when you talk about the 2 different types of hypertrophy, the myofibrillar and the sarcoplasmic, I actually think they correlate relatively well to two of the 3 mechanisms for hypertrophy. So we have mechanical tension, which is essentially just the tension placed on your muscles. So the way that I would think about this is like when you do a rep of an exercise, there's a stretch shortening cycle where there is an eccentric portion of the rep where the muscle is lengthened, and then there's the concentric portion of the rep where the muscle is shortened. That essentially can be looked at as if you had a rubber band and you were just kind of stretching it and letting it go and stretching it and letting it go. And the muscle is almost, what's a good analogy here? It's like it's achieving a callus, a small callus, a very, very small callus every time that you stretch and shorten and stretch and shorten. It's like the muscle gets more dense. Maybe that's the better way of saying it. Maybe callus is the wrong word, but it gets more dense with each stretch and shorten and stretch and shorten. And over the course of time, this tension being placed on the muscle grows the muscle. And that's essentially mechanical tension. So anytime that you lift weights, you're actually receiving mechanical tension. So even as you're doing metabolic stress, which is our second form of muscle hypertrophy, even in doing metabolic stress, which primarily causes sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, you're still getting mechanical tension through that. So in no way can you ever avoid mechanical tension. Like literally the act of getting out of your chair and standing up is creating mechanical tension. Not a whole lot of it, but some of it. So when we talk about metabolic stress, we have to understand that mechanical tension is born into metabolic stress, but then it's kind of taking it a little bit further, because you can have mechanical tension without metabolic stress by doing sets of singles or doubles or triples or whatever. You just can mostly avoid metabolic stress within the muscle. But as you do higher reps and as you do things like supersets, as you do things like drop sets, intensity techniques, extended sets, as well as movements that are primarily overloaded in the short position, you will incur a lot more metabolic stress. And you can just think of metabolic stress essentially as that feeling of burning in your muscle. So a lot of people say like, oh man, the lactic acid in my muscles is killing me right now. Like it burns so bad. That literally is just metabolic stress. Like it's just different chemicals being shuttled into your muscles and cutting off oxygen supply, causing stress, metabolic stress. So those are kind of the two primary ones. And then the third one is muscle damage. And I think damage is really interesting because maybe up to a couple years ago, the idea was that in science circles was more like you kind of want to mitigate muscle damage. And now I think it's kind of shifting where the understanding is that muscle damage is just a result of mechanical tension and metabolic stress. I think that you could break that down a little bit further and say that muscle damage is going to be more prominent in a lengthened overload movement. So these things that we're obsessed with, that we talk about all the time because they promote more hypertrophy and, they're going to help your muscles grow faster. These are the movements that also cause you the most damage. They make you the most sore and things like that. So if we're going to sit here and say that lengthened overload movements are the primary way to induce hypertrophy as quickly as possible or maximally or compared to a short overload movement or something like that, then we also have to accept along the same lines that muscle damage is in some way a good thing because of the lengthened overload movements that we're in love with are the things primarily causing muscle damage. It's not that you don't get any damage in metabolic stress because you certainly do. But you're going to have to do a lot more of those movements in the metabolic stress range to probably incur the type of muscle damage that you might incur from doing more mechanical tension based lengthened movements.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was like, I don't know if you're just taking a pause because you were spitting fire right there. And I was like, I don't want to stop this. This is Brian's crushing it right now.
And then I ran out of things to say, man. I was like, I should have given you like, all right, what you got on that?
Stop talking. So, I mean, yeah, this was super, super cool because what I briefly alluded to in the introduction of the episode is historically, when left to my own devices, let's say that when I'm programming myself, I've just done a lot of the metabolic stress style training. I mean, obviously there was some muscle damage when I would do like RDLs and that sort of thing, but I would generally program higher reps, more, metabolite pump work just because I historically always just gravitated towards more volume. And I was like, hey, I'm decently jacked. I'm still getting bigger and looking better. Like why, if it's not broken, like kind of why fix it type of thing. But really it was just some short-sightedness in my education around these things. And it's been really, really interesting and fun now as I've, had more conversations with people like Brian, as I've gone through the N1 stuff, just to really broaden my horizons. And now I think like, man, I've really beat this metabolic stress horse, for years. Like what more do I stand to gain by really prioritizing more time in, muscle damage style training blocks, more mechanical tension based blocks, and like where can I really now explore these and try and create the most rounded year of training in my pursuit of maximal hypertrophy. And I think it's really, really important just to have these types of conversations because like I personally feel like we are at an all-time high of like interest in gym and hypertrophy. And this is from me being here right now we're living in Tempe, Arizona, which is where Arizona State is. The gym is packed with college students, like getting after it, right? I went to the gym, like Jenny was gone. Yeah. So I went on Friday night. I'm like, God, it's Friday. Finally, the gym's going to be empty. It's Friday night. I shit you not. 8 p.m. Friday night, this gym is fucking packed with college students. And I was like, oh, wow. Like there's a shift in like culture kind of thing, right? You wouldn't catch Aaron Straker dead in a gym on Friday night in college. Like no way in hell. And with this, I just see a lot of people. I feel like it's your influence are different when you're younger and stuff, but a lot of people are doing really stupid shit. And I feel like, unfortunately, even though we have so much more research in the realm of literally there's research, right? People, their entire livelihood is just on researching ways to improve hypertrophy and stuff. We still have so much of just like not pragmatic. What's the dogmatic, not knowledge, right? Or maybe I should call it information that people get kind of like sucked into. And I really just want to, help other people earlier along in their journey to understand and learn these things. Like I was 32, 33 years old, training for 16, 17 years before I started to understand these things. And I just think it's really, really cool and want to be able to help people understand this and learn it earlier on and help them make more gains, better gains in a shorter period of time, with maybe some lesser mistakes, really.
Yeah. What would be the main thing on the front of your mind that you would change if you looked back at like, if you look at these college kids, what's one piece of advice that you could give to them right now that you think would help change their journey along the way?
The only thing that comes to mind is nutrition and sleep, but that's outside the bounds of this conversation. But if we're talking about things that are going to move the needle, like that's what it is. Yeah. But within the bounds of this conversation, I would say, understanding the simple basics between lengthened overload and shortened overload stuff. And if you're doing because people, actually, let me back up and take that back. Sorry, I spoke too soon. Understanding, pairing, not training movements, training training movement patterns and muscles, not exercises. Because people will be like, oh, it's legs, so I'm going to do the hack squat, and then I'm going to back squat, and then I'm going to Smith machine squat. And I'm like, well, basically just doing the same movement pattern with 3 different exercises. You know what I mean? And it's like, you're not going to get what you could get out of the Smith machine squat because you just did the back squat and the hack squat before. So really just understanding kind of like what you said earlier in the episode, where you're like, hey, I'm training, at a commercial gym now. I can't go from, I can't remember what you said, to the one superset to, the rear delt row, which is in the other movement, but I know I can set the cable here or low on the ground. I know that shortened rear delt position I want to find. I can mimic that with this machine that's right next to me. So just understanding what muscle group you are trying to target, or which fibers of what division fibers do you want to create a stimulus out of, you can manipulate your environment that you have immediately available to recreate that with a little bit of creativity and knowledge.
Yeah, I think avoiding overlapping movement patterns would be a huge one for sure. That is good. And also the idea, you use legs as the example of we're training legs today. So you have 8 different movements and 7 of them are quad movements. And then there's some leg curls in there or something. But you get the same thing with back training. People literally are like, I'm training back today. And you're like, okay, what part, Cause it's when Cass said this, when he goes when people talk about training the chest, they don't say I'm training front today. Cause what is front? Front is everything, So yeah, there's so many different regions of the back. And so when you're saying I'm training back, the amount of times that you've seen people with a 7 exercise back sequence, and it's 3 rows where the elbow position is the exact same and the pull position is the exact same. And you're just okay. So that's a good one. I also do think that where you were going with that first one is good too, because even if you don't even know the name of this is a lengthened overload movement and this is a short overload movement, just understanding that some movements fail at a position where you're at more risk, and other movements fail at a position where there is no risk, and being able to utilize that to train at different intensities and just the plethora of different knowledge that you can garner and implement into your training when you understand that these movements kind of stimulate your body a little bit differently. That can then send you down further paths and open up, other wormholes for you to go down. So, it's great for the most part that people are just in the gym lifting weights and that the general idea and the culture is improving. But like also when I meet people now that are teenagers or like early 20s college kids that are lifting, and I talk to them about, who do they follow, where do they get their information and stuff like that, it's still usually a lot of those big names like Steve Cook, Mike O'Hearn. Like it's a lot of these people with like millions of followers in the hypertrophy game. But I'm getting more and more people that tell me that Jeff Nippard is one of their top like 2 or 3 that they follow. And these people have no like evidence base, like they don't follow Helms or like Israel or Schoenfeld or anything, but they know Jeff Nippard. And that's pretty cool because Jeff is doing a great job of distilling down a lot of that science into understandable, digestible ways for people to implement their training. And so I think through following Jeff, you'll at least be introduced to the idea of, lengthened and short overload movements and the 3 mechanisms for hypertrophy and stuff like that. So we will see these people as they continue to go through the space. Like some of them will drop off and they'll probably stop training after college and they'll become like husbands and dads and, working men and stuff like that, working women. But others will have that kind of passion ignited and they'll take it further and further and further. And those are probably the ones that we're the most interested in talking to as they continue that journey.
100%. Yes. I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up this episode. So is there anything else you want to add, Brian?
No, man.
Perfect. So this, in my opinion, right, it's a little early to say, maybe one of my favorite episodes we've done. I feel like it's been like the application is super, super high. It's something that, I don't think a lot of people understand at a sufficient level. And it's just by scratching the surface on a lot of this stuff can really influence the decisions you make in your own training, how you approach it, and how you can kind of understand why certain training days may be more damaging. You have more DOMs than others. Just really, really cool conversation all around. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with me and the listeners. As always, Brian, we will talk to you guys next week.